There are two new schools of thought that emerge from these new ways of thinking during the age of anxiety. The first one is called logical empiricism, and this is developed by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a member of a group of philosophers in Vienna called the Vienna Circle. Now, logical empiricism was basically the idea that all philosophy was just sort of clarifying thoughts. In other words, there was no real point in most philosophical discussions. The major philosophical questions that all these thinkers asked did not have any answer, or there was no way to answer them. For example, the existence of God, right? There's no way to actually prove this. So according to logical empiricists, there's absolutely no point in talking about it. He believes that all these philosophical ideas are senseless because they cannot be tested. A quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein is, "Of what one cannot speak, of that one must keep silent." In other words, just don't even talk about these philosophical ideas. There's no way to prove them. According to Wittgenstein, the only thing that is worth analyzing is actual, tangible experience. So again, not these sort of abstract ideas that philosophers often discuss. Another idea that emerges from the age of anxiety is existentialism. And existentialists basically argue that there's absolutely no meaning to anything. That any experience, any meaning that is associated with it is created by humans. Most existentialists were atheists, which I would hope sort of makes sense because they basically would not assign any sort of experience to, there's no greater power that ultimately is responsible for it. However, existentialists do believe that one must act on on experiences, even if something happens that has no meaning, existentialists must have some sort of response to it. So existentialists, when they were talking about what to do with the rise of the Third Reich and the Nazi Party, they ultimately determined that the important decision to make would be to act against it. So that's sort of a generalization about existentialists, but some examples. Probably the most well-known is French Jean-Paul Sartre. He argued that life had no meaning and that humans simply exist in it. Sartre's existentialist ideas made him very attracted to communism. He also, this sounds sort of counterintuitive, but he made the argument that man is condemned to be free. So he didn't necessarily see this as a good thing, right? Because there was no meaning to life. If man was condemned to be free, he sort of had two different decisions to make. The more morbid one would be to kill oneself, right? So Sartre said, if man is condemned to be free, if he does not kill himself, he must act. And Sartre believed that through our actions, we can overcome the absurdity of life. So, and here's a quote from him: "All things are born without reason and die by chance, therefore there's no meaning neither in life nor death." So we can think about Sartre's ideas as very much associated with the age of anxiety because he does not determine that there's really any meaning behind life. Albert Camus, another well-known existentialist, he, in a way, you could see him as a little bit more optimistic than Sartre because he believed that individuals had to find a meaning to life by taking action against those things to which they disagree. Okay, so in other words, he believed that all actions were derived from personal choices. They are independent from religion or political ideology. So I would argue that he is much more in favor of kind of political activism. You can kind of see how even if as an existentialist he doesn't inherently see meaning, he advocates a much more active approach to deriving meaning in life, I would argue, than Sartre. There were also Christian existentialists, so it's important to realize that not all existentialists kind of feel like there's the same means to an end. They, like atheists, are they kind of feel this experience of loneliness and despair from the post-war period. They believe, like the atheist existentialists, that humans were sinful, but they also believe that inherently life doesn't have meaning, but this meaning can be created, that it needs to be created. But here's where they differ, the second column. They believe that the way to derive meaning from life would be to find God again. Okay, so they stress the need for faith and also the mystery of God's forgiveness. So to them, because this whole new way of thinking in the age of anxiety is associated with unanswered questions, non-rational thought, they believe that one of the best non-rational ideas to turn to is the existence of God. One of the most well-known Christian existentialists was Soren Kierkegaard. His works actually were written in the 19th century. You can see this here. So again, his ideas actually came about before the age of anxiety, but they experienced a rebirth. They became really popular during the age of anxiety. He believed that, basically his ideas kind of led to this huge revival in Christian belief after World War I. Just the idea that, at least Christian belief was something that these disillusioned people could hang on to. He came up with the idea that in order to truly believe, one must take a leap of faith. So we can associate that saying with him. Also, Christian existentialists in general felt like the only way to sort of answer to the really troubling times of the age of anxiety was to find Christian faith. This is just sort of a visualization about how Christianity was seen as the lifeboat, or the, kind of way to save society from completely drowning during the age of anxiety. Okay, literature. So we see a lot of literature is dystopian in form, or anti-utopian. We see that literature is very much reflecting of the sense of anxiety. Authors oftentimes are very upfront about their confusion. Characters themselves can be confused. Even the style of writing itself can be confused. And so stream of consciousness becomes a really popular style of writing, which is incredibly confusing. James Joyce's Ulysses is a really good example of stream of consciousness. And I'm not going to read this whole passage for you, but if you just visualize it here, you see this is an incredibly long sentence, very difficult to follow. Right? This basically just writing down every single thought instead of taking the time to punctuate, taking the time to kind of make shorter, more succinct thoughts. Another example of an American writer who used a lot of stream of consciousness was Virginia Woolf, and I think the most well-known book that she writes is Mrs. Dalloway, which also reflects this style. One example of a poet from this period who reflects the age of anxiety was Paul Valery. He described a lot of the crises of the age in his poetry. He often spoke about how the mind was cruelly injured. It was besieged by doubts. It was suffering from anxieties due to all the economic, political, and social disruptions of the 1920s. And I like this poem, The Blank Sheet, because it's actually about an author who's staring at the blank sheet of paper that he's meant to be writing on. And I think we can all sort of relate to this experience when we're trying to write a paper, for example, and we're staring at that cursor just flashing, and that sense of anxiety that's associated with it. So again, we'll take the time in the video to read it, but you could pause and just take a moment to read this and understand why this reflects anxiety. So some dystopian authors, Oswald Spengler, he writes a very well-known book called The Decline of the West. Basically, he's reflecting upon how the lead up to World War I is showing the West at its worst, right? How imperialism is showing the inherent selfishness of Western civilization, and how in a way World War I shows the beginning of the demise of Western society. He believes that all cultures experience basically a life cycle, right? That they, kind of like the plot of a book, that they build up and they gain power, they reach sort of an apex, and then they decline. And so his argument in The Decline of the West was that the West was now dying after World War I, and eventually Asia would surpass the West as the great power. T.S. Eliot wrote one of the longest poems in this period called The Wasteland. His Wasteland poem, again, it's describing a really desolate, desperate world. The Wasteland begins with a section called The Burial of the Dead. A well-known quote from that is, "April is the cruelest month." Many parts of this poem are indecipherable. They're fragmented. People who studied T.S. Eliot said that he was actually reading Joyce's Ulysses while he was writing The Wasteland, so that gives you a sense of how unclear the language was and who he was inspired by. He also uses different languages in the poem and does not translate them, and sometimes he actually uses nonsensical phrases. So reading The Wasteland might make you really frustrated, but that's sort of the point. Okay, another very well-known anti-utopian or dystopian author was Franz Kafka. You probably know him most for The Metamorphosis, so a story about a man who actually is transformed into a cockroach. And essentially, he is trying to become accepted again by his family, by the people who surround him, but they can't because he's been transformed into this kind of hideous beast, and he eventually dies. And Kafka sees a person like the protagonist from The Metamorphosis as very hopeless, and there are all these outside forces that destroy these kind of characters. So again, that sort of helplessness is very much associated with the victims of the First World War. All Quiet on the Western Front is probably one of the best immediate reflections of World War I itself. It's written actually about the horrors of trench warfare. So again, take a moment to pause this video and read this quote here just describing one man who dies on the Western Front. The book is meant to be depressing in nature, but at the same time there's almost this sort of peace that is associated with this man's death. George Orwell, actually more of a dystopian author from the post-World War II period, but actually the Age of Anxiety really, in a way, lasts until that. So 1984, which was written in 1948, so just reverse those two numbers. Pretty well known, you might be familiar with the idea of the Big Brother or a totalitarian dictator who creates a state that observes every action of the population. It uses sort of a new language, new forms of technology, and it uses forms of psychological terror to completely strip individuals of their human dignity, watching them at their every move. The idea behind George Orwell's 1984 was that by that point, humans would not make any decisions for themselves. They would be completely controlled by these outside dictatorial forces. And he writes the book, he calls it 1984 because in 1948 he's visualizing society turning to that point, that these fascist totalitarian dictatorships that we saw on the rise leading up to World War II would continue and completely take over any sense of free will or individual thought. Last, you also see some of these ideas manifesting themselves in theater. So a good example of this would be Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Samuel Beckett was an Irish playwright, and this play also reflects a lot of the pessimism after war. So Godot comes out in 1952, so again, you can kind of see this as also a post-World War II idea. But throughout this play, these two characters that you see here are waiting for a character named Godot, and analysis also see Godot as possibly a godlike figure. But as the play ends, this character never comes. Also, just like some of the literature that we saw, the dialogue is very disjointed, it's confusing, and that's kind of the point, to leave the audience frustrated. So in the next video, we're going to talk about changes in science and how these also lead to a lot of disillusionment in the Age of Anxiety.